Okay, so
I'll just hop in right here. So this is the winter bird webinar series. So it feels, or the winter webinar series. So it felt really appropriate to cover birds in winter. This is something that's kind of always interested in me. Um, you see these birds surviving in these really amazingly challenging situations where just it seems like the whole world's white and dead, but the birds are surviving. And I learned more about it when I went and worked down in Jamaica on the Red Starts about 15 years ago. The Smithsonian and a couple universities have been running a project down there for over 30 years. And it made me think about what the birds are actually doing in this other part of the year. And one of the things Pete Mara said while we were down there was looking at um, some some paper. He was the Pete Mars, the head of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, or he used to be, was at the time, and he said, looking at this paper, and it says birds have four major life history events: migration, breeding, and molt. And he's like, well, wait a minute. They spend 7 months in their non-breeding situation. That's actually the majority of the year is spent non-breeding. And here I call it the longest, hardest, and oldest season. And what I mean by the oldest season is it's often the bird's most ancestral season. So many of these, especially if we're talking about migrant birds, resident birds also, but migrant birds evolved in these wintering situations where they spent their wintering grounds. The migration is a derived characteristic. They adopted the migration, but they historically started in these in where their wintering grounds is. And we have a lot of evidence of that. I threw this crossbill up just because it's an interesting picture. But those birds, bill is made to feed on cones. It's evolved to feed on cones, so they're always near the cones. But this worm-eating warbler has one of the largest bills of any North American warbler. And it doesn't need that bill to feed on the summer. It's that bill is evolved to feed on its wintering grounds where the bird originally was. And then down below, we have this oven bird. Oven birds feed on the ground in leaf litters, but they evolved in around the Caribbean, most likely, feeding on the leaf litter in these tropical forests, and then only adopted the migration. So this is a huge part of the bird's life, and it's honestly probably the biggest hint to their ancestral history. Why is wintering or non-breeding less studied? Well, there's some really obvious reasons for that. First of all, it's hard to interpret the behaviors. Breeding's really, really easy to understand. Like all things in biology, it's incredibly complicated, but it's pretty easy to understand. They feed the young, and they have to get enough food for the young and protect the young and defend a territory. Pretty straightforward. Winter, they just have to survive, but it's way more complicated than that. Of course, migration is fascinating. There's dozens of books on migration. They're all really interesting. Bird migration is one of the most kind of beautiful things that occurs in nature, and we don't have that strong of an understanding of it still, even though it's heavily studied. Um, the birds are not linked to a territory. It's a lot easier to study birds when they have a nest and you know they're going to be there every day. And if they're not, there's a reason they're not. In the winter, the birds aren't linked to a territory, or a lot of them aren't. They just go wherever they want. And the birds in the winter can be more secretive. It's not 100% that, but in general, when a bird's singing on a territory and raising its young and fighting off other birds, they're pretty visible. A great example is the Connecticut warbler. I was just reading through the Birds of North America account. It used to be they were known from two sites in Bolivia. And now it's expanded because of geolocators. So now the whole thing's about two paragraphs where it's like, well, they're from two sites in Bolivia where they've been seen, and they're probably in this specific habitat in southwestern Brazil and Bolivia and maybe Paraguay. But we're still talking about there's been 2 dozen sightings of Connecticut warblers ever on their wintering ground. So some of these birds just disappear. Um, so non-breeding, why is it important? I'll talk about this one at the end there. Connectivity is really important. Every aspect of a bird's life history feeds into the next section of its life history. So if breeding's late, molt's late. If molt's late, migration's late. If it has bad food on its wintering grounds, it's going to migrate later. This all feeds in together. it lets us learn about the flexibility of behavior. Birds have to do generally pretty specific things during breeding, but they're not stuck to those things in the winter. So we see all kinds of different behaviors that we do not see during the breeding season. And winter is the hardest season for the birds to survive. For some birds, migration kills a lot of birds, but winter is what manages populations in a lot of these birds. Predation rates are much higher. The weather can have a huge impact. And when it comes to winter and almost all bird distribution, it almost always has to do with food. And winter really has to do with food, right? So how do we know winter's the hardest season to survive? Well, I talked about the red starts. I'm going to talk about these red starts a lot because there's not many 30-year studies on overwintering songbirds, but the red starts have that. We would catch these birds in early winter, which really means like full on December, January, straight on through March and April when they start to depart. They would lose weight throughout the winter. So the red starts would go from 12 grams down to 10 grams, maybe even 9 grams. And bear in mind, these birds are not raising young. They are defending an exclusive territory, but all they're doing is defending their territory and feeding, and they're losing weight throughout the winter, which is pretty spectacular. If you head down to Jamaica, there's plenty of food, but that's just not how it is. The foraging hours actually decrease. So it's a 12-hour day at the equator. But if you're anywhere north of the equator in winter, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter. But most of these birds, when they're breeding, they're well north of the equator and the day length may be 16 hours. But in winter, it decreases unless you're an owl. Owls love winter, and then the foraging hours increase. It's a reduced land mass. So if we're strictly talking about North America, if you think about the size of the United States and Canada compared to Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, obviously there's some things about how the globes work and flattened maps, but that's a significantly smaller landmass. Very few of these songbirds are making it to South America. Most of them are going to Mexico and Central America. And when they show up, there's already resident birds there. So they go from northern Canada to Mexico, and there's already resident birds there that they have to compete with. This isn't always true. Most European songbirds nest just south of the Sahara in the Sahel belt, and those birds actually, when they show up, the birds that bred in the Sahel belt have already migrated south, so there's nobody there. But that's not really how it works in the neotropics. So they show up, and yellow warbler is a great example. So we have this yellow warbler on the left here that I photographed and banded at Wellfleet Bay, and then on the right we see the mangrove subspecies of the yellow warbler. So this bird migrates south. It shows up in the Caribbean and Central, and there's already yellow warblers, resident yellow warblers that live there. So now they have to contend with these resident birds, which are generally larger and smarter. Resident birds are smarter than migrants because migrants reduce their brain size, so they don't use too much blood during migration. But you can't just take a territory from somebody who's already there. Another reason we know that it's the hardest season to survive is bills are optimized for winter foraging. So whimbrels winter in northern South America, among other places. It's essentially a global species. They breed in around the Hudson Bay and up in Alaska and kind of that section of Canada. And then, as we know, they come through the Cape in the fall and spend significant amount of time here. So that bill has evolved to feed on fiddler crabs. That bill is the size and length of a fiddler crab burrow. It's perfectly optimized for feeding on fiddler crabs, but not on the Hudson Bay and not in Cape Cod and not in Kansas where they migrate. It's perfectly evolved for them to feed on fiddler crabs on their wintering grounds. That is the length of a fiddler crab burrow on their wintering grounds. So that tells you right there that that's the season that has the most impact on their ability to forage because the bill has evolved to fit that individual. These three birds pictured below, those are Cape May warblers. Caribbean winterer. Cape May warblers are nectivorous birds in the winter. In the summer, they are known as spruce budworm specialists. The spruce budworms do well in the boreal forest. These birds explode. They have massive nests with more than 5 young. They might have multiple clutches. They're practically known as the spruce budworm warbler, but their feeding is optimized for feeding on nectar in their wintering grounds, not on spruce budworm. So that tells you right there that the hardest time for these birds to survive is on their wintering grounds. And then another thing they hit is reduced territory size. So redstarts share a territory, male and female. The territories, the size it takes to feed the young. They have exclusive territories in the winter, and they're much smaller. Golden plovers, when they're breeding up in the high Arctic, their territory for a breeding pair might be a square kilometer. And their wintering grounds, it's about 15 square feet. They can find everything they need there, but they're really packed in there, and they lose weight throughout the winter until it's time to migrate. And sanderlings, we think of sanderlings as little flocks of birds running up and down in the waves. But once they actually reach their wintering grounds, many times they are territorial. Now they might roost together, but they have an exclusive section of beach that's all theirs, and they will chase other birds away from. And when they're on their breeding ground, it's a giant patch of tundra. But when they're on their wintering ground, it is a small section of beach that they fight all others off of. So why do these birds migrate in winter? It's about the food. It's not about the cold. Finches go south till they find pine cones. It's not the snow. It's not the cold. It's the access to food. Now, cold can impact these birds, and snow can impact these birds. The Bohemian waxwing is another great example. We have those birds are in Montreal right now. Now, it's not much of a winter this year, but it's supposed to be deep winter, and these birds are all over Canada because this cold doesn't impact their access to berries. It's about food, not cold. So drivers of winter range, these birds breed, they go south. What drives where they end up going? Or as we'll see in the next slide, they don't always go south. But what drives that? It's the access to foraging. Ducks need open water to forage. Geese need open grass. This woodcock right here, this was a big event when I was working in Virginia about 15 years ago. The eastern shore of Virginia doesn't get a lot of snow. It got completely covered with snow, that 3 feet of snow, not 3 feet, maybe 2 feet of snow. These woodcocks had moved just south of the snow line, just to where the ground was thawed, and then it gets covered with snow, and you can see this guy he jammed his bill into that same hole for 15 minutes because it was not able to forage. Finches, we talked about the finches. The cones have to be present. So there's a handful of finches in Montreal right now. There's a handful of finches on Cape Cod. I guarantee there's some crossbills there right now. But for the most part, these birds move south until they find a good cone crop, and then they'll spend the whole winter there. It's just about food. It's not about the cold. But they don't only move south, and this is why we know it's not just about the cold. So snowy owl, we had an explosive year of these. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, where they just went everywhere. They showed up in Hawaii. They were catching them at the Logan Airport a couple a day. They were all over on the Cape, and it really drove people's interest in snowy owls. And it's a pretty big bird. We could put a satellite transmitter on those. And what we find is when they're done breeding, they just go wherever. Some of them go south. A lot of them go north. They'll spend the whole winter in the Arctic Circle feeding on these ducks that are pictured here, spectacle eider. It's a bird that you might recognize from the bird book. Pretty hard to recognize from real life because they breed in northern Alaska, northern Canada, just on the south end of the Arctic Ocean, Arctic Sea. And then when winter comes, they actually fly north into what would be the packed Arctic ice. But since there's thousands and tens of thousands of them in one little patch of water, kicking and diving and feeding, it never freezes. So they winter north of where they breed, but it's safe enough unless there's a snowy owl up there. England's another good example. A lot of birds that breed in Europe go to England for the winter because England's temperate. That's not north. That's not south. It's a little north for a lot of these birds. But you also get birds from Scandinavia that come down to England. But you get a lot of birds that come from Europe to England. And in really cold weather, they'll abandon Europe completely and head over to England. That being said, many European and Asian birds do go to Africa, but England's a big stopover spot. That's where most of the song thrushes go. And then, of course, temperate New England is pretty much the similar situation as England, and temperate New England is Cape Cod. So we see a lot of these impacts of birds coming to winter on the Cape. Body size is a big driver of this winter range. So short distance migrants, the body size really is a big driver. So short distance migrants are birds where their breeding grounds and their wintering grounds more or less overlap. What that really means is birds that breed in North America, north of Mexico, and winter in North America, north of Mexico. So this is like sparrows and juncos and hermit thrushes, things that you could see in the winter. The body size is a big determinant. The males are usually bigger and they'll winter farther north. The reason this also works is because then they can get back to their breeding territory first. So if they winter farther north, they're closer to their breeding territory and they can quickly get there and set up their breeding territory, because it's much easier to defend a territory than take it from another individual. Another example of how this works is the saw-whet owl. A lot of people are aware of the saw-whets moving south. This is actually one of the most numerous birds in North America. It's huge banding operations. What they catch in the fall, they catch young birds and females. They don't catch adult males because the adult males stay on their territories all winter. These birds are in the boreal forest. It's cold up there. There is food, but there's only enough food on the territory to feed the adult male in the winter. So the females go south and the young birds go south, but the adult males defend their territory all winter. Age and sex. So we we're talking about how this drives the range. So the yellow warblers, they've moved down to Jamaica, they moved down to Mexico, and there's a whole dominance thing. The males are dominant over the females, the residents are dominant over the migrants. So if you look at the quality of foraging areas and exposure to predators, the residents have the best foraging and the least exposure to predators. The females are driven out to the edge, the most exposed areas. They show a lot more feather wear and they show much higher rates of predation. The kestrels are kind of a different deal. During migration, the females move first and then they set up the dominant territories, and the young move before the males, and the young set up the dominant territories, and the males are stuck on these kind of less good outer, less open, more forested territories. But then when the males go back, they become territorial. So the female's still dominant, but the male fights, and the male's definitely dominant over. So the dominance can really change in the winter, and it really impacts. I mean, the yellow warbler thing's famous, where like the migrant female hatch-year yellow warblers, they do not get a good place in the winter. So the need to be territorial in the winter, you see some different behaviors in the winter. You do see territoriality. It's a very common thing in the winter, but some birds are just fully nomadic. They just kind of move around. They don't have a nest. So why compete with the birds that do have the nest when you can follow a resource that moves throughout space? And then, of course, you see a lot more flocking. I mean, this is the dream flock we all want to see. This is actually one of those famous migration fallout images, but it's just such an incredible image. I want to see that flock of warblers in the winter. So territoriality. A lot of birds hold territories in the winter. Redstarts are a great example of that. So each bird holds an exclusive territory. Only that redstart is allowed in that territory. There's other birds in that territory. They're not worried about those birds. So the males get a better territory than the females, and the adults get a better territory than the young. Now with redstarts, this works really well because you can see here that there's some plumage differentiation. So the top left, that's a female. The top right, that's a young male. And the bottom is an adult male. So the adult male is the most dominant one. And this makes a huge impact because they're in two different types of habitats. The there's the mangroves, which are wet and full of bugs, and then there's this dry forest that's called logwood, a very original name for a tree. It has logs, it's made out of wood, but it's this dry, scrubby. There's way less insects in there. You have to spend there's less shade. Everything that you don't want, this has. And it has a huge impact. So they all of them lose weight throughout the winter. And then the rainy season comes right before migration, and there's an insect bloom. But the insect bloom's not equal. It really happens in the mangrove. So all these adult males are able to put on weight and migrate. The females and the young males can't actually put on mate until they have access to wait till they have access to the mangrove. So the adult males leave, the females and the young males then move into the abandoned territories in the mangroves, build up their weight, and then migrate. It's really effective in a system where males migrate first and then females migrate after. But if you're a young male or an older male that somehow can't get a mangrove territory, you're not going to be able to get your breeding grounds early enough. And then you're going to have to try to take a territory. And that's the connectivity. The quality of their winter territory impacts their ability to migrate on schedule, which impacts their ability to get a good territory, which impacts their ability to get a good mate, which impacts their ability to breed. It all feeds into it. Winter is very important. So we talked about those winter territories. It's important to understand the difference. Breeding requires a sedentary territory. So the size of the territory is the minimum size needed to provide all the food for the young. Again, non-breeding does not require a territory, although like we saw in the red starts, many of them do have a territory. But look, you got these little mouths to feed. You have to stay within that area to feed that guy. He's going to be hungry. So nomadism, a lot of birds just move around in the winter and follow food sources. This is much more common in Africa, where the rains move throughout the winter, and it's just a much larger landmass than it is in Mexico. Sequential wintering sites, it is best known in Africa. So yellow wagtails, the first thing they go to is Nigeria, and they feed in these wet reed banks. But eventually the banks get drier and they just pound insects. It's a mathematical formula that the more foraging you do, the number of insects that exist in the area go down. And what happens is eventually all the adult males stay, and then all the young birds and the females continue to move south. And what they found is the yellow wagtails males set up territories along the permanent streams so they can stay, but everybody else has to go south. And this is just a real common thing in Africa. The rainy season goes from north to south. And the birds just follow the rainy season because the rainy season means insects. And then there's some flexible site fidelity as well. So white storks feed on these water sources in Africa, and they're semi-ephemeral, so they may last for years, or they may disappear in any given year. So the birds will continue to use them until they disappear, and then they'll move on. Corey shearwaters is a bird you can see off of the Cape. They all breed in the same place, but then there's 6 different spots they go in the winter, covering huge amounts of areas, no problem for shearwaters. So they travel thousands of miles to these wintering sites. And what they found is that the adults will often use one or more per winter, but often just one. But they obviously know about these different wintering sites that are thousands of miles apart. And if you think about it, it makes sense when you think about how these birds live. So 9 years between hatching and breeding in a Corey shearwater. For those 9 years, all they're doing is spending their life at these non-breeding wintering sites. So the young learn all the sites before they ever breed. And then they're able to kind of choose among them and jump from one to another throughout the winter. So flexibility there. And then territoriality is also flexible. Remember, these birds have flexible behaviors in the winter. They're not linked to young. So sanderlings, they have territoriality in the winter. They have their little stretch of beach that they defend. But if you introduce merlins and those horrible little claws we see there, all of a sudden the sanderlings aren't territorial anymore. They spend their whole winter in little flocks. So they can always, it's always safer in a flock, eyes on the sky. For if you have one pair of eyes, you have to spend as much time watching for predators as foraging. But if you have 8 pairs of eyes, you still need to spend the same amount of time watching for predators, but you can split it up among all 4 individuals. So there can always be somebody looking to send the alarm call. So everybody gets to forage more. And yes, they go from territorial to flocking birds with the presence of this study. There was 2 years of the study. The first year they had no merlins on the beach. Second year they had 3 merlins on the beach, and they saw the birds' behavior change completely. Jamaica versus Puerto Rico, black-throated blue warbler, American redstart. Jamaica, there's no accipiters. They don't have this little Puerto Rican sharp-shinned hawk here. So the birds are very, very territorial. In Puerto Rico, where there's these bird-eating hawks, they're much more likely to be found in flocks. So they can actually be territorial or flock depending on the presence of predators. The predators are really impacting the behavior here. Diet also drives it. Redstarts are insectivorous all winter. Black-throated blues eat a lot more berries and fruits and nectar. So as the season goes on, the redstarts stick to their territories. The black-throated blues will stick to their territories while they're feeding on insects. But then as the insects dwindle and the berries are just kind of spread equally across the ecosystem, they're not spread, they're in bunches across the ecosystem, black-throated blues will start to form flocks. So territorial part of the year, flocking part of the winter. Territorial when there's no predators, flocking when there's predators. Flexibility. This just shows us that these birds can do a lot more than what we see on the breeding grounds. Okay, so that's about distribution. That's a lot about tropical birds. But what about the actual cold winter birds? Let's pretend that it's snowing outside and that it's, winter still happens. So what is impacting these northern birds? First of all, snow, rain, and cold. It's about foraging, but snow, rain, and cold definitely impacts these birds. The ability, because what it does is it affects their ability and their access to forage. Predation impacts can have a huge, huge impact on distribution and numbers, as we talked about how it impacts the behavior. And then we're going to touch on surviving the night, because that's pretty interesting. We're snug in our bed and we still get cold. So we're going to talk about a couple studies from Old England here. This is a very popular place for birds to winter, and there's a lot of bird love and biology there, so there's a lot of good studies. So rain is bad for some species and snow is bad for other species. So in rainy winters, the tree creepers, which is the exact same indistinguishable species, technically a different species, 100% indistinguishable from our brown creeper and the sparrowhawk. So when it rains a lot, the creepers can't get their feathers wet and they can't feed. Snow doesn't impact them. They feed on the trunk of a tree. Sparrowhawk needs to be able to hunt. And if it gets wet in the winter, it can't hunt. So they're not going to hunt songbirds on rainy days. So when rain is bad for them, but then snow is bad for the Eurasian wren. So these birds feed on the ground. The snow covers the ground. There's no access to food. So different weather does impact different birds differently. And cold can have impacts as well. So this is European oyster catcher. There's actually a couple different individuals here. There's a difference in the bill. You can't actually tell from the picture, but the male has a larger bill and the female has a smaller bill. And this is incredibly beneficial to the species for most of the year because it means they're feeding on different food resources so they can both use the same territory without competing with each other directly for food resources. But in the winter, there is a catch. The male eats mussels, the female eats worms. But if it's cold, the worms go back down into their burrows and the females have less access. But it doesn't impact the mussels at all. So an extreme cold weather impacts the females more than the males. But this is a beneficial anti-competitive behavior that helps them most of the year. And most seasons, it's fine. And most winters, it's fine unless you get a cold snap. And size does matter. These birds need to feed. So a European blackbird, which is essentially the equivalent of a robin, American robin, can survive 2.2 days without feeding. Some of these smaller tits, this is a great tit, it's a larger tit, but some of the smaller tits, half a day. So that means they can survive the night without feeding if they feed all day, 12 hours. And that number goes down when it gets colder. So here's some great examples of how the winter does impact these birds. In England in 1978, they had an extremely cold winter. Birds less than 10 grams declined by 40%, but the larger birds over 100 grams were unimpacted. A chickadee is about 12 grams. So when we're talking under 10 grams, we're talking pretty small birds, but we're talking a couple species of their smaller tits, like cold tits, would fall under that. Wrens would definitely fall under that. And then in Quebec, they had the huge ice storm in 1998, famous weather event up here. So all that's what this picture is. Everything was just covered with ice for like 2 weeks. So the birds that survive in winter here got hammered. Brown creeper, chickadee, downy, and hairy. Next year, when they did the Christmas bird counts, 20 to 40% decline in those species that have evolved to survive in this. So extreme weather has a huge impact on these birds. They want things to be consistent, and when they're not consistent, it messes them up. And that's one of the things we're seeing in climate change is more extreme weather. Right now, what we're seeing is they had migrants showing up. Where did I see that post? Somebody's like, yeah, we already had our first. Oh, it was in Quebec. They had red-winged blackbirds migrating north last week. Well, those birds made a mistake and turned around and went back south. And a Cape Cod example. It's always good to get one from New England, not just Old England. In the Cape Cod winter of 2014 to 2015, after, say, January, February, it rained or it snowed every weekend. So for about 2 months, there was snow cover on the outer Cape, which is, as you all know, is pretty unusual for the snow cover to last that long. The Carolina wrens, which are a species that has recently arrived this far north, got absolutely hammered. They were breeding at Wellfleet Bay where we banned, and then in that spring, we didn't see a bird, we didn't catch a bird. And then in 2016, they were back, and the same male that came in 2016 is still on his territory in 2023, hoping to not have another really harsh winter. So they can only survive half a day as a chickadee without feeding, 2 days as a blackbird or a robin. So how do they manage to get food when it might snow for a few days? Well, they put on fat is one reason or one way they survive that. So this grouse will do that, but the salt marsh sparrows, I was working with those down in Virginia. Nobody really knew that at that point, but these birds live in tidal marshes. And the tides, depending on the wind, can actually, there's a strong south wind, the tide might not go out. It's supposed to go in and out, but if it's really extreme weather, the tide sometimes doesn't go out. If it snows and the marsh gets covered, they can't just go and feed in the forest. They have to feed in the marsh. And what we discovered was a lot of them were holding significant amount of fat, which makes sense because if they don't get access to their food for a couple of days, this is a 15-gram bird. It needs to digest something. And the other way is caching. So these chickadees, the ones that live in Cape Cod, where it's generally pretty mild, don't have to hide that many food items. But if you watch them when they come to the feeder and they fly away with the seed, sometimes they peck it open, but a lot of times they just jam it inside the bark somewhere. So they have their food storage spread throughout their winter range. And some of these chickadees, the ones that live in Alaska, in more the northern areas, the part of their brain dedicated to memory is actually much larger, and they can remember up to 10,000 individual seed locations. Then the next summer they forget them, so they don't get confused next winter. And that varies based upon the amount of daylight for foraging, which is related to their latitude. Gray jays also cache. A lot of these larger jays and crows will do that. find some meat, bury it. Guess what? It's winter. It's not going to rot. Just go back, thaw it out, away you go. You see this too with owls. You know, in the summer, you can't store 50 mice. They'll just go bad. But in winter, you can store as many voles as you want. They're just going to freeze. So that's a pretty popular one. This is kind of a unique example, but it's one I really like. So this is black-billed capercaul. They're a grouse that lives in Europe. This is the Siberian example. We get a lot of really good winter studies from Scandinavia, because if you look at the map, most of Scandinavia is very, very, very far north, but there's huge populations up there. So they can actually just like go to the boreal forest down the street from their house and study these types of things. So both of these birds, the male and the female, feed on larch buds throughout the winter. The buds are on the small, newly growing branches. So the females can fly to the top of the trees and feed on the branches. So they can access the buds, but the males are too heavy for that. So what the males do is maintain these larch gardens, as you can see on the bottom right here. And all they do is munch on 100 and 150 trees a day. And by pitching off the top of them, the trees don't grow up, they grow out. And then they produce more things for the birds to feed on. And some of these gardens are multi-generational, 70-year-old gardens that are just maintained by these birds to survive the winter. Pretty cool to think of these birds gardening. Okay, so a lot of people wonder about bird feeders in the winter. Are bird feeders beneficial to birds? Do they hurt birds? Do they become dependent on them? It seems to be that especially when it comes to something like chickadees, it's an extreme cold only. When it's really, really cold, the birds want to get maximum effort, and that's when the feeders become very important. When there's snow cover everywhere and the birds don't have access to forage, feeders become very important. We put out feed here as soon as it snows. Do they become dependent on them? No. So there's a great study where they had chickadees that were never exposed to feeders, and then one winter they went into this woodland and put feeders up everywhere, and the chickadees fed on the feeders. And then on extremely cold weather, the flock that had access to the feeders did slightly better than the flock that didn't have access to the feeders. Next winter, they take the feeders away. So one flock has never had access to feeders. One flock has had access to feeders for a single year. So did they become dependent on them? No, there's no impact. Next season comes along, the birds that had feeders last year that don't have feeders this year, exact same survivorship as the ones that had no access to feeders ever. So that's good. You're not making the birds dependent. It can be beneficial to them. You take them away. If you take them away midwinter and that flock's dependent on it, could have an impact. But if you take them away and they're not there next year, birds are just fine. And it can have a huge impact on certain species. So here's the Carolina wren again. This is a northern pioneer species. They are spreading north. They've only been on the Cape for, I don't know, 30 years now. That might be even a little bit, whatever. They've been around for about 30 years. So there's this study took place in like Indiana, and what they found is at the start of the winter, the Carolina wrens were kind of equally distributed through wild areas and residential areas. But by the end of the winter, there were a lot more Carolina wrens in the residential areas. And that's because they had access to feeders. As you can see here, one peanut is a quarter of this bird's energy it needs for the winter. Carolina wrens aren't huge at feeders, but as they start to not have access to forage, the access to the feeder is allowing them to survive a little better. But these birds didn't evolve in a snowy environment, so they're finding a way to exist in it. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Predation impacts. So these are some interesting, shockingly high numbers. Redshanks wintering on this one bay in Scotland. In the course of the winter, 50% of the population there was lost to predation. 90% of juveniles. So 50% of them aren't surviving the winter. Now you take that 90% off, okay, it's something like 20% of adults aren't surviving the winter, due strictly to predation. But then you look at this other number. So they mark these birds. In the spring, 47 marked birds departed. In the fall, 36 of them came back. So what's that? 3/4 of that number? 3/4 of them migrated, bred, and returned. Now they could have just gone to the next bay over and disappeared. You're going to lose some of them to that. So you're talking about 50% loss during the winter, but during the rest of the year, less than 33% loss. So yeah, predation can have a huge impact on these birds in the winter. The Dunlins, 50 of them on a single bay in British Columbia, 50,000 of them on a single bay in British Columbia. During that season, 14% of peregrine chases are successful. That's a huge number. I've seen a lot of peregrine chases. I don't know if I've ever seen a success. And these Dunlins, as a result of that, don't go to the above the high tide line and roost when they feed in the intertidal zone. So when the tide's high, they don't have access to food. So that's when shorebirds roost. These guys just fly out over the ocean for 4 hours during high tide to avoid the peregrines. So they're feeding and then they're flying and then they're feeding and they're flying. The whole part where they're sitting around on the beach resting, they've removed that from their behavior for the entire winter because of the effect of predators. And finally, surviving the night. So these birds, fine, you're feeding all day. Food is energy. Food keeps you warm. You're moving, but at night, you can't feed at night. You have to survive. And it's winter. The night's long. So we've done some kind of studies, and a lot of winter birds use cavities. If you think about all the birds that winter here, the robins and the starlings and the house sparrows and the kinglets up here, we're in Montreal, don't use cavities, but pretty much everybody else is in a cavity. So with mountain chickadees, they just found that it's 13 degrees warmer in the cavity, which if you flip that over to Fahrenheit, you can essentially double it. So 26 degrees warmer in the cavity. That's a lot warmer. And that transfers to 7 more hours of life because they need the energy is what's keeping them warm. The food's what's allowing them to burn their furnace. 7 more hours of life in a cavity than sleeping outside a cavity. That's huge. And then the cavity orientation. So Tibetan ground tits and downy woodpeckers. Tibetan ground tits make a cavity in the snow or the ground. Downy woodpeckers in a tree. During the breedings, the Tibetan ground tit makes 2 cavities. One of them is its breeding cavity that can be oriented in any direction. Then there's its wintering cavity, which always faces directly south into the sun. Same thing with downy woodpeckers. During the breeding season, they make a cavity. It faces any direction in the tree. There's probably something about the local conditions driving that. In the winter cavity always faces south directly into the sun. Matters because they have to stay warm. Shared cavities. So not a lot of these that have been known. Not a lot of people going out to mess with the bluebirds on freezing nights, thank God. But this one person found 14 bluebirds sleeping in the same nest cavities. They were arranged in 2 layers, like the spokes of a bike, with all their heads facing together, all their tails facing out, one stacked on top of another. Probably so all their breath is going together to help keep them warm. And the tail is just feathers. So there's this way to conserve heat. Pygmy nuthatches, 100 individuals in the same cavity, 150 individuals in that very tree. So that's a huge flock. That's multiple flocks coming together to spend. And yeah, there's some balance to everybody roosting together. When you find these giant shared roosts, there's almost always a few dead birds in there. Maybe they were birds that didn't get enough food, or maybe they were birds that were too close to the bottom and got suffocated. They're shifting. There's dominance. Chickadees will nest 10 of them in the same cavity. And you can bet the dominant male and the dominant female have the best spot, and the least dominant birds have the other spots. But yeah, I want to see 150 pygmy nuthatches coming out of the same cavity in the morning. Black-capped chickadees. So this is a little bit about hypothermia and torpor. These birds will actually reduce their operating temperature in the winter. So chickadees, 35 to 41 C, that's a huge variation. Imagine if our body temperature changed 12 degrees throughout the course of a day Fahrenheit, we'd be dead. And at night, they actually lower it. So at night, they have a lower operating temperature, but that's flexible. So black-chinned hummingbird is a southwestern breeder. So if it's like cold at night, around like freezing, their body temperature will just be a couple degrees above that. But if it's very cold, like 0 degrees, well, they actually use more energy to keep their body temperature up at about 32 or 38 or whatever it is. But they don't waste the energy when it's only a little cold, but when it's in very cold, they do have to react to this. And then the kinglet. So this is one of my favorite little winter birds. There's actually some of these as far north as Quebec right now, which is really impressive. So how do they survive the night? No cavity. They all roost together. They find a nice pine that's protected from the wind, and they'll tuck up under the needles, and they'll tuck their head under their wing, and they'll huddle together, and then they'll reduce their body temperature to survive the night. They really are a perfect example of the challenges that face a winter bird. It's a very small animal, so it has to forage nonstop. 99% of daylight hours are spent foraging. They feed on springtails, which are available all winter. They find them in the conifers, and they're so desperate to feed that they just leave the appendages on. There's no nutritional value in the appendages. They're hard to digest. They tear your throat up. They don't have time to clean. In the summer, they'll clean these. In the winter, there's no time for that. So they just eat the appendages whole. They'll forage in large mixed species flocks. By large, I mean like 10 birds. So they'll hang out with the chickadees and the titmice and the woodpeckers. But then when they go to roost, those birds leave and these birds roost in the trees. When it's really cold out, they'll do less fighting among their group. They'll hardly react to predators when it's cold. They'll see a kinglet 2 feet away from them get munched by a saw-whet owl, and they won't even fly away because they're maintaining their temperature. Like I said, they roost among groups of kinglets. So they just find a nice, it's a favorable microclimate, which just means someplace where it's a little warm and out of the wind. And they can survive -10 F and probably colder, which is really, really impressive. This is one of my favorite winter birds. And finally, connectivity. All seasons are connected from the egg to the grave. So the bird's wintering territory impacts its condition at the time of migration, which impacts its ability to migrate quickly, its ability to migrate on time. The wintering impacts the molt. A lot of these birds, if you look at that Cape May warbler, that's one, they change their plumage before they breed. That happens on the wintering grounds. So if they don't have good forage, they're not going to grow good plumage. If the male doesn't have good plumage, not going to attract a good female. Boom, wintering is impacting their breeding. Breeding impacts molt. If breeding takes too long in fall, you have to molt after you breed. You got to replace all your feathers. Well, if you have to shorten that, your feathers are less good. So then your migration is impacted, or your migration starts later, or you have to start migration while still molting. Molt impacts wintering. You got to molt early to get to your wintering ground to defend your territory. And of course, if you grow low quality feathers, you're going to be colder in the winter. And then breeding impacts wintering, because if you're not breeding in time, you're not migrating in time, you're not getting your wintering in time. And this is just the flow of birds. I mean, the young birds, when they're still young birds in the nest, so they've hatched, teeny little songbird, looks like just a little pile of skin. Well, its brain is listening to its father sing, and it's learning the song while it's still in the nest. But if it's not provided enough food in the nest, the brain's not developing quickly enough where it's not learning the song. And then that'll impact it its whole life. All of these things are connected. Wintering impacts everything, breeding impacts everything, migration impacts everything, all of this stuff throughout the entire bird's life. Really, really important. All right, thank you all very much. Made it to the end of my talk here.
Thank you, James.
And we have a
Wow.
little time for questions.
So if you have a question, you could raise your hand or you could put it in the chat. Thanks again, James. That was awesome. I'm impressed. I have to find a little kinglet now.
Yeah, right. There's some around. Go to the little I guess I don't know that much where they are. I think they're in the little red maple clusters, but they're there. There's definitely kinglets out there right now. It's amazing.
I'm,
Yeah,
I'm
like
gonna
I
I'm
said,
gonna go searching.
Yeah, they're really something. Less than 6 grams and surviving the winter out there. And yeah, I tend to just throw a lot of information out here. I really love examples, so I focus a lot on examples. But if anybody has any questions they think of later, they definitely can email me down there at my email address there.
And we are recording this, so it'll be available on our website sometime soon. So lots of so a question from Elaine: what are the best trees to plant on Cape Cod for bird support?
Yeah, so if we're talking about winter, cover and food are really important. The answer to that question always starts with native plants. Native plants are incredibly important to insects and birds, but in the winter, hollies and what are they? Cedars are really good. They provide a lot of cover and they're native plants. But even things like rhododendrons and things like that, anything that kind of stays and provides, I mean, hollies are golden because they provide food and cover, but cedars are really good too. Let me say up here, they're like, you get sick of those funny little pines, but the birds like those pines. They provide cover. No more pitch pines, though. There's plenty of those.
Okay, lots of thank yous here, and excellent presentation, says Amy. Any other questions? We've got some. Again, if you want to refer to some of these slides in the future, they will be up on our website, hopefully in the next week or two. And our next webinar will be next Saturday, and it is, who is it next week? Let's see. Our next webinar will be talking about our restoration projects. So if you're really interested in seeing what we're doing here in Chatham and native plant restorations, sign up for that webinar, and then that'll be followed by our favorite native plants for all situations. And
Ooh,
yeah, and then we
that's
have
a good one.
edible native plants and tree identification coming up in April. So there you have it. Another question here. Why are we not seeing too many birds at feeders? Is that
My guess about that would be is because the food is available in the ecosystem right now. It's been a pretty mild winter overall. So the birds, they will use the feeders, but they're not dependent on the feeders. So they're probably finding enough food away from the feeders right now.
great?
Yeah, it's amazing that the chickadees are absolutely amazing. There's a few really good books on chickadees. I think the lady's name is Susan Smith. So there's a kind of a pop science one on chickadees that's like a wild bird guide, but then there's one that I think is Susan Smith wrote about chickadees. I could be wrong about that name, but that's a fabulous book. And it's just like years and years of studies that they've done. They're very, very well studied animals, and man, they are fascinating.
Yeah, that's an impressive stat that Christine is referencing. All right. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you next Saturday.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'd like to give you an idea of these birds exist in this moment, but they also exist kind of across time and space. So when you go out and look at a bird in the winter, you can kind of think of how this moment is impacting all the other moments of the bird's life, which is really how I like to think about them.
Everything's interconnected.
Yep.
All right. Thanks again, folks. James, if you could stay on for 1 second, I've got a question.